quick step! Woo!
Did you know if you have a numpad on your keyboard, you can mash out of these left-right prompts of some bosses, like Pierre and Gloom? The intended way is to hit the left and right arrow keys as fast as you can to get out of it, but hitting both the arrow keys and the left and right keys on a numpad, 4 and 6, in unison will mash you out of them way faster. Around twice as fast. One thing that helps to know in bosses is when they're about to do something drastic because they hit a certain threshold of HP. Did you see it? Pay attention to Pierre's health bar. He transforms around less than 70 to 75% of his health remaining. I think closer to 70%. In fact, he doesn't even change forms until you reach that threshold. Similarly, when he splits, that happens around 30% or less of his health remaining. You can nowadays tell this by the percentage remaining on the left, but it's a neat thing to note that you can, to this day, still kind of eyeball it with the death counts head icon. Around the middle of the head is when he splits. These thresholds help out when learning how to get into bigger Maple bosses, as a lot of them have thresholds for them doing certain mechanics around certain percentages of health. All the Rudibus bosses especially. There's also Damien, who straight up changes forms around 30% of his health. For other bosses, such as Lucid, they can become enraged and increase the frequency of their harder attacks. In Lucid's case, it comes in the form of more dragon summoning, more sickles, more golems, and more touch and lasers during part 2. I won't go over every boss mechanic, as there's just so many that I haven't even gotten around to myself yet, admittedly. But here's some that I feel would help a lot of newer players and hopefully ease their frustrations. Some bosses can reduce your damage immensely, essentially making you around 10% of your total damage when affected by their hazards. In this case, Magnus's Barrier, which requires you to stand within it, not only to do full damage, but to also heal. There's also Damien's Blue Balls in part 2, which you just simply have to move away from. Lastly, Gloom's Eye being closed, which opens up every minute or so. I believe this is the only time-gated one in the game. One skill that can't be overstated how useful it is in some situations is Hero's Will. It might be called something else on other classes, just as a heads up. Like this. If used properly, not only can it remove certain debuffs like Seduce, but it can skip over entire boss mechanics. Things like Lucid teleporting you during part 1 of her fight, or Pierre's hats. If you use it right before he changes forms, you won't get a hat on you, meaning you don't have to worry about healing him with every hit if it's the same color hat. It also prevents the hats he drops on the ground from affecting you entirely, too. On that note, if you do have a hat on you, you can remove it with a well-timed intentional death, and either respawning and bursting before he changes forms, or waiting until he changes forms and then taking him down for good. Deaths in general are very useful in bosses, as they're essentially a 35-second iframe. 30 seconds once you die, and 5 extra seconds right before you respawn. If you're in a boss with 5 lives, that's nearly 3 minutes of downtime for you to stop and plan out what to do next, or just wait out certain mechanics. In a boss with 10 lives, that's nearly 6 minutes you can wait out. If you throw on max level resistance link, even longer. That's 8 extra seconds per life when you respawn in where you just take no damage. Some argue how useful this link skill is, but I personally love it as I'm not a huge fan of dying randomly multiple times in a row in such a short period of time during a boss. Having that extra cushion of buffing up or preparing to bind and burst helps greatly. It's also worth noting that you do have a small period of invulnerability when respawning anyways, of about 1 to 2 seconds. Use this to your advantage and get into position when you do come back into fights. Also, don't forget buff freezers so you don't lose all your buffs when you die. In Reboot, they're 5 mil each in the cash shop. In a few updates, I believe you'll only ever need one, as they won't be consumable. Here's a list of some buffs that help a ton when bossing. The red, blue, and green pots from Monster Park. Red gives 30 weapon attack, blue 30 magic attack if you're a mage, and green gives an extra stage of attack speed, which is useful on nearly all classes. If you're in a guild, check to see if you have a quest in your white light bulb called Dea's G Potion. It gives you 30 atmospheric attack buffs every week, 30 minutes of 30 attack. Also, you could help your guild out every week by doing Culver and Flag Race to rack up some more points and get some good 30-minute buffs that can give percent damage, crit damage, boss damage, and ignore enemy defense, or IED. Another really good atmospheric buff is from Ursus. Once you're able to fight Ursus, the materials you get from clearing can be used to buy these buffs. They don't cost much, nor are they too difficult to get, and that's another 30 attack for the entire map you use it in. Some other buffs include Onyx Apples from Amoria PQ, Sparkling Red Potion from boss drops or Fedric in Rudibus after defeating a boss, Tengu's Atmospheric buff, which lasts for an hour instead of 30 minutes, though I believe it's only 20 attack instead of the normal 30 for other atmospherics, Echo Skills, Housing's boss buff, and sometimes events give out pretty decent stat buffs at certain times occasionally. Lastly, this one is more in the pay-to-win territory, but every rolling period for Maple MVP rewards at Bronze gives 2 30-minute 30 attack buffs. It's not an option I recommend for everybody, as I don't personally want to influence others to spend money on this game. But if you've already spent a bit of money on this game through cosmetics or style boxes, it's at least worth mentioning your MVP status doesn't decay past Bronze. Even if you spent as little as $10 to $15, you have these rewards already, permanently, every refresh period. When you're in parties either helping do damage or being carried, try to be helpful. Use your buffs, make sure you turn your summons off before box rooms so you don't accidentally ruin the boss drops. Try to offer a class bind or Urdanova if you have it on when available. And study up on boss mechanics so you can not only survive longer, but also just make it easier on your entire party. Cleansing Damien's swords and Lucid Butterflies goes a long way. Some classes can get past things like Lotus Lasers without taking any damage. If you have a dash, you can't really bypass them, but if you have some skill that either teleports you or acts as a portal, you can skip over them freely. Binds are incredibly useful for all classes, and there's a lot more incentive to have one nowadays with more recent changes to Urdanova. Shorter cooldown, no more cast time, just an instant bind for 10 seconds. Bosses have a bind cooldown of 90 seconds, and some classes get longer bind times, like Kana and Ho-Young. Ho-Young's is only by like a second though, it's literally like 11 seconds versus the normal 10 seconds on binds. Kana's is 15 seconds. If you're confused as to what a BA is, it stands for Battle Analysis. There's a couple ways to do a BA before heading straight into a boss. The first one, which is the older method, is getting a straw target dummy or wooden target dummy from the dojo shop and setting it up per boss you wanted to test out how much damage you could dish out on it in a certain amount of time. The more common method nowadays would be just simply getting to floor 30 of dojo and unlocking Fog Forest training grounds. It's not too hard to unlock floor 30. Here, you can freely set up dummies however you want, adjusting it per boss you wanted to attempt. Usually this is done for bosses like Lucid and higher, but it can be done for any boss really. Every boss has their own criteria and BA setups, so I'll link a quick rough BA guide for some bosses in the description. Every class does their BAs differently, so if you wanted to learn more about proper burst and BA rotations for your class, you can find most of this information readily available online through YouTube by searching up your class and BA, or class-specific discords. There's nearly 50 classes to go over at the time of making this video, and I don't want to give outdated information, so I'll leave it at that as the game changes around skills frequently, and their values and buffs and nerfs randomly sometimes. Like, why did Ho-Young get a buff this patch? They didn't need a buff. I hope any of this information was useful for you, and that you can topple them bosses that have been giving you trouble. A lot of this information is fairly available online already nowadays, but I figured I'd try putting together a few tidbits that might help newer players figure out how to make those bosses they're struggling with a little easier. People seem to have liked my last tips and tricks video, and I planned on doing one about bossing anyways, and I didn't include all the information of bosses in this, but I gave a vague overview of how to help, like, make bosses a bit easier. So I hope you enjoyed this one too. If you have any thoughts or ideas of what you want to see next from me, leave me a comment or send me a DM on any of my socials. Your comments on my last videos were greatly appreciated, along with the reception of those videos. Those exceeded my expectations, and they definitely gave me some good ideas for future ideas I now have for videos. So thank you for that. Y'all are the best. That's all.